Talk about why we want to save prairies. It should be an easy talk because you guys are already here, which means you're already interested in it. So. Prairie is the largest ecosystem in North America. We have 170 million acres of just tall grass prairie, the dark green part. And less than 1% remains, probably much less than 1%. Before the 1990s, this was the map showing prairie. Once people from Texas and Louisiana got involved, we went, hey, you guys forgot about this coastal prairie. So later maps show our prairie down there. It's the most threatened ecosystem in North America. Very, very diverse population of mammals. There were 4 big herbivores, bison, deer, elk, and prairie dogs when Columbus got here. But before man got here, there were over 40. Most of them went extinct, and probably due to overhunting. There were cougars and wolves and bears that were predators. There were a lot of small mammals, great diversity of small mammals. There's still a lot of them, including the prairie vole, which went extinct. Lots of grassland birds. Grassland birds are the fastest declining group of birds in North America. The Atwater prairie chicken disappeared from Louisiana a long time ago, and I think it's functionally extinct now. The population is so small. Mottled duck, Saint-Luc sparrow, the 2 cranes, whooping crane, and sandhill crane. And meadowlarks. When I was a kid, you drive through the country, they were on fence posts calling, they were iconic, and now getting rarer and rarer. Lots of herps. Most people don't care about these. Most people don't like snakes, including my neighbors. But they were a critical part of the fauna of the prairie. This is a black-masked racer on my farm by the pond eating a rat. And by the way, if you look at the factors that affect success of prairie restoration, seed predation by birds and rodents is on the list. So snakes help in prairie restoration. Malcolm brought up the fact of flying insects, particularly at night. When I first started at the Wetlands Center in 1993, I'd bring my kill jar. We'd meet before the sun came up to go in the field, and I would collect insects, thousands of insects flying around there. When I retired 4 years ago, not even a lone moth bumping into the lights. They're all gone. And an amateur study in Germany where they set up Mealy's traps to catch flying insects, did it for 27 years. When they analyzed the data, there was an 82% decrease in flying insects in just the 27 years of the study. Everybody's interested in pollinators. We've got a lot of questions about them. Prairie is by far the richest habitat for pollinators in North America, or grasslands, or tremendous pollinator diversity in prairie. And plant diversity. Prairie is one of the most diverse ecosystems in North America. The only one that I know of that exceeds it. But with the few remnants that we have left, starting with the work that Dr. Vadrine and Dr. Allain did, inventorying remnants, and we continue to find small remnants and inventory. We found over 600 plant species occurring in remnants and restorations. And if we worked a lot in coastal Texas, because coastal prairie goes all the way down to Corpus Christi, in the entire range of coastal prairie, over 1,400 plant species, incredibly diverse. So when ecologists talk about how you value prairie, they generally end up talking about ecosystem services. And ecosystem service is how the ecosystem benefits man. When I first heard that, I thought, well, what difference does it make? But that goes back to metaphysics. You know, if a tree falls in the forest and there's not somebody there to hear it, does it make a sound? If we disappear, you know, what difference does prairie make? So there are 4 categories of services. And this is a long lecture, so I'm just going to go through it real quickly and then give you some examples. There are provisioning services. That's the products we obtain, like food, raw materials, medicine, fresh water, hunters, people who hunt birds and deer. There are regulating services. Those are the ones that regulate the environment, like air quality, climate, water purification. Then agricultural and recreation, aesthetics, values. You know, we try and encourage people to, like the Native Plant Organization, to landscape with these plants. They're really beautiful. And prairies are beautiful, although there's something of an acquired taste. Religious, spiritual values, knowledge and education. And then the big services that underlie all the others: photosynthesis, nutrient cycling, water cycling, and soil formation. And this is just the veneer of services that these systems provide. You can spend an entire lifetime studying ecosystem services. So let me give you a few examples. One is water. Prairie vegetation captures rainfall, precipitation, and funnels it into the ground through infiltration and percolation, allows it to come in and recharge the soil water, build up the groundwater supply, and it gradually, as Malcolm explained very articulately to us recently, the water moves laterally through the soil to recharge rivers and lakes and maintain the hydrology at the landscape scale. Reduces erosion and nutrient runoff. You know, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, nutrient runoff is a real concern. But probably the thing that concerns most people is how it mitigates floods and droughts. Houston, the Houston chapter of the Prairie Society has really focused on flooding in Houston and how the Acadian Conservancy acts to allow stormwater management to prevent flooding. It's really, really critical in flood control and in droughts because it allows more water to charge in the groundwater level to reduce the severity of droughts. Soil gets a lot of press today. Building healthy soil, that's regenerative farming. That's what farming and gardening is really the focus currently. So it not only reduces erosion, it builds soil. These prairie species, they improve soil structure by adding carbon and making stable aggregations in the soil. They do an amazing job of sustaining and developing soil biota, which we are learning more and more is really critical to soil fertility and agriculture. And there even recently been some articles published saying that some of the bacteria from soil actually helps build our immune system. So farmers and people who work outdoors who are inhaling these soil biota that get airborne are healthier for it. And one of the most fascinating aspects of the effect on soil is the way that they capture and store carbon. In fact, prairies store more carbon in the soil and sequester more carbon than forests do, and it's more stable because when forests, mostly in the trees, when the tree falls, it rots and the carbon becomes airborne again. Prairies sequester it below ground, long term. By the way, this is I love this chart. This is a comparison of an annual grass with a perennial grass. The annual grass is on the left. Look at the difference in root system. The root system of these prairie plants are phenomenal, and they go really deep. In this example, they go down 3 meters. But in the Midwest, they can go down really, really deep, several meters deep. Prairies will help us adapt to climate change. Doug Ladd, who is an ecologist with the Missouri Nature Conservancy, wrote a great article, and in it, this sentence really sunk in for me. In response to climate change, vegetation will adapt or move or perish. And there's a lot in that sentence. So how do plants adapt? They adapt with genetic diversity. That's the material that plants and animals use to evolve. And when they're presented with new environmental factors, they need that genetic diversity to adapt. How do they move? By seed dispersal. What do we do when we plant a prairie? We get Steve or somebody to go and collect seeds from the few that we have left, and we have to transport them to the site. So those seeds are not readily available anymore. In 2011, 500 million trees died from drought and fire in Texas. 500 million trees. What happened historically when we had dry periods and wet periods, during these dry periods, fire behavior got extreme, drought killed trees, and the prairie and these dry forests integrated. And as I mentioned in my tour, during dry spells when trees died, the prairie colonized the forested area and stabilized it. And the forest and the prairie went back and forth over geologic time depending on rainfall, because prairies aren't there anymore. So when all of those trees die, there's nothing to take their place. We have to restore prairie to create the resilience of these grasslands and have them on the ground in such a way that they recruit naturally into dry forests. So some of the best places to restore prairie are in dry savannas adjacent to dry prairie. So genetic diversity, I love this quote by Aldo Leopold. I think they have some copies of Sand County Almanac for sale back there. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. One of my favorite books. He said to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. We have to save the parts. And not just the species, we have to save the genetics. We have what we call ecotypes, plants that are specifically adapted over thousands of years to South Louisiana, and we need to preserve those genetics and as much of it as possible. So I have an example from Hurricane Rita. We worked on some restorations in East Texas where we got little blue stem and plants from inland in Texas, north of Houston, and we planted them on the coast. And in Hurricane Rita, same year as Hurricane Katrina, there was a storm surge, and one of the prairies that we restored was next to a remnant. The salt in the storm surge killed all the little blue stem in the restoration, and it didn't kill the little blue stem in the remnant. The remnant population was resistant to the salt level of the storm surge. That's one example of how genetics is critical, and you never know what adaptations are going to be important. You need the genetic diversity for that. So. So 40% of the world's surface, had a map in here, I guess it didn't copy. 40% of the world's surface were grasslands historically. I don't know if most people know that. But worldwide, they're turning into deserts. Desertification is destroying them, especially in brittle landscapes. 13% of grasslands were converted to prairies in just 14 years when the UN did this study. So it's a real concern. And grazing, Alan Savory, for those of you who are familiar with his work, is an ecologist from Africa. And he made some really, really insightful discoveries and really brings the role of grazing home. When you look at a clump of big blue stem like this, the grass, once it's finished flowering and producing seed, it senesces. Everything above ground dies, essentially. The tissues die. And in the spring, when new green leaves appear at the bottom, they're shaded by the above ground part of the plant. So if you don't remove the above ground part of the plant, the grass declines year after year after year until it dies. it can't compete with last year's senescent vegetation. Two ways that's removed. One is by grazing animals, and the other is by fire. Those things are essential for rejuvenating the prairie. Anyone who's ever been on a prairie after it was burned, 6 weeks after the burn in the spring, there's green grass everywhere. It's really packed. So what do the cows do? They remove the senescent vegetation. They walk around and they trample all of that dead vegetation into the soil and bring it in contact with damp soil and bacteria and fungi and cause it to decompose and stimulate the nutrient cycle. And they deposit urine and feces, which also stimulates the nitrogen cycle in the soil and really revs up the soil biota in a way that's critical for maintaining fertility. So those of you who are on the tour may have realized that I've become very infatuated with the idea that agriculture is a primary way that we can save the genetics and save the prairie. Regenerative agriculture doesn't necessarily always involve native plants, but it makes so much sense. So these diverse prairie pastures are very drought resistant. In 2011, when my Bahia grass pasture turned brown, prairie grasses kept growing, very drought tolerant. Very nutritious. Eastern gamma grass is one of the most nutritious grasses cattle can graze. And these grasslands provide ecosystem services that we can't even imagine. The reason that I like the idea so much is there's a financial incentive to plant these pastures. Although it's not economical currently to do on scale, we're working on that. And you guys can help. And people like Steve and guys in the Prairie Society are trying to bring down the cost of seed and planting methods so that we can plant native pasture. Once we establish those, grazing are a critical part of it. So the farmers are actually providing everyone a service by managing these grasslands with grazing. Another really interesting technique for using prairie and row crop agriculture is planting these prairie strips. And here's some data from a series of studies. It was a review paper. It said that pollinator species, there's a twofold increase in species of pollinator, threefold increase in abundance, twofold increase in bird species, 95% less erosion, 89% less phosphorus export, 84% less nitrogen, which, as you know, is a real critical area. The Dutch farmers, you may have seen, are protesting because they're reducing the amount of nitrogen that they can use on their crops, and 42% less water runoff, all by planting these pollinated strips in row crop agriculture. And then finally, education, and that's what Phyllis has managed to pull together here. We need to teach people. We need a cultural shift, and people need to learn the value of this system. The reason I think that prairie is, first of all, the reason that prairie is gone is because it was the most fertile land. That's where the settlers plowed. But the reason that we've allowed it to disappear is because people just aren't connected to it anymore. We didn't have any national parks that were grasslands until Bill Clinton signed the first one in. If there weren't mountains, if there weren't sequoias or waterfalls or cliffs or canyons or snow-capped peak, we didn't make it into a national park because people think grasslands are boring.
That's it.
And I like to say that I heard somebody say it flies under the conservation radar. I don't think it's even on the conservation radar. We need to change that through education. And I'm really excited about this workshop today because this is exactly what we do. So.
That's a miracle. I don't think Larry's ever talked that short before. We got time for questions.
I practiced it. Yeah.
The prairie strips, do you do it around the garden or? those or?
So
Larry, can you repeat the questions?
she asked if the prairie strips go around the perimeter of the garden, how they arrange them. Generally, they plant them along the same, parallel to the rows. And they plant them, they're different spacing, different techniques. There's a guy in Canada who puts them about 100 meters apart, which is pretty far. But if to put them around the perimeter, another technique they use that I didn't mention are buffer strips. So if you can plant it, if you field drains in a particular direction, you can plant buffer strips adjacent to the fields to capture the runoff water and to capture the nutrients as they leave your field. These strips generally are parallel to the crops, and in Europe they're farther ahead of us. They do what they call pollinator pastures, where they plant pollinator species adjacent to pollinator crops, and then they make sure that they have species that flower throughout the pollinator season, but they don't put anything that coincides with that crop. So if they're growing almonds, there's something in flower all year except when the almonds are in flower, and then the bees leave and go into the almond crop. So which species you plant, and the things like alfalfa, pollinators are critical in a lot of row crops, even cotton, soybeans. They really enhance productivity.
Could you speak really quickly about Cajun prairies and areas that maybe controlled burn and grazing is not an option? So if you are just mowing down annually, what that looks like?
She asked about when burning and grazing aren't an option, and that's a really good question because over time, in the absence of fire, woody plants, it'll turn into a forest unless you physically remove the trees. So mowing and haying, as I mentioned this morning, are a pretty fair substitute. Not perfect, but pretty fair. And you have to vary the time that you mow because grasses typically don't mind mowing like broadleaf plants do. So if you mow at the wrong time, you favor grasses and you hurt. There's a lot to it. So the short answer is yes, mowing is a good substitute. Haying is better, and by haying I mean removing the biomass after you mow it, so you're not mulching the prairie. There's no substitute I know of for grazing, though. And eventually over time, we believe that prairies will lose species in the absence of grazing. Because the big bully plants, the big grasses, and the big wildflowers will outcompete the small guys over time. Although it may take a very long time. A cool story about a prairie in Missouri that the Nature Conservancy bought, and they were stored around the remnant. And at another location, they were trying to bring back the Gulf frillary butterfly, and they were raising them and doing captive release, and they weren't having very much luck. And then they decided to put bison in their prairie, and when they did, the regal frillary butterflies appeared in the prairie. And the reason is because their host plant was a violet that only got 6 inches tall. And they'd been managing it with just fire, no grazing. And so the violets never flowered. The violets were still growing, but they were underneath the canopy. Once the animals grazed, the butterflies could find the low-statured plants. So grazing is important, but there's not really a good substitute for grazing. But
Thank you.
I was wanting to ask about like tilling and because you talked earlier today about, you till 6 times to get the weeds. But then are you worried about carbon leaving the soil when you till so much? Or is that kind of like offset by what you're plant there?
that's a great question. And a lot of people advocate using herbicides to eliminate the vegetation. And tilling is an alternative method, and tilling is bare soil is bad for the soil. We do no-till. Our vegetable garden is entirely no-till. We try and keep the ground covered at all times. So yes, you burn up all your organic matter tilling for a year. If you have 2% organic matter, 3%, which is good for Louisiana, you'll have less than 1% after a year of tilling. That comes back with prairie, so that's not a concern. Another concern is the soil biota. Can do a lot of damage to the soil biota. So it's not necessarily that I tilled 6 times. The goal of cultivating is you allow everything to germinate, and then you till it right before it goes to seed. You don't want it to drop more seed, and you kill those plants. Then you let them germinate again, and then you kill those plants. And over time, you deplete the weed seed bank. Yes.
Is there any situation where you have like overgrazing, like too many cows in the prairie, depending on the.
That's a whole nother lecture in the next workshop. She asked if there's such a thing as overgrazing. The majority of the prairie we have left in Louisiana is south of Lake Charles on big land companies that were owned by, they grazed cattle, and it was never plowed. And it's still prairie, but it's really overgrazed and really beat up. And a lot of species have been lost. So the answer is yes, you can overgraze it. And rotational grazing is a solution, but that I'd be happy to give a talk like that in the future. Great question.
Schedule.